Chapter 129, Geto's Childhood. On Christmas morning, Geto woke up early. Too early. He groaned softly. His head felt congested and heavy. Gojo's eyes fluttered open. "Babe," he muttered, combing the hair out of Geto's face with his fingers. "Satoru, my head hurts. I'll get you some water." Gojo slipped a hoodie on and made his way downstairs, careful not to make too much noise. The kitchen glowed against the dark of the rest of the house. Gojo hesitated. He didn't want to startle whoever was there. "Hello?" he called out softly. Masato was chopping vegetables at the sink. He glanced over his shoulder, then continued cutting. "Couldn't sleep?" Masato asked. Aiko had told him about Geto, and he'd had his own trouble falling asleep after that. He decided to come downstairs and meal prep instead of tossing and turning in bed. Gojo leaned against the counter. "Suguru needs water." "I put some bottles in the fridge for him," Masato said, using his knife to slide the veggies into a bowl. "Because Suguru gags if the water is too warm." Gojo didn't mean to finish Masato's sentence in unison with him, but it was too late. There was an awkward silence. Masato clenched his jaw and set the knife down on the chopping board. Gojo retrieved a cold bottle of water from the fridge and lingered at the counter. "I don't understand it," Masato finally said, back still turned. Gojo didn't answer right away, and for once, he didn't try to fill the silence. Masato wiped his hands with a towel and finally turned to face Gojo. "Suguru has always been difficult to read." "Yeah, he can be," Gojo said. "But you," Masato paused, "you see him." It wasn't a question. Gojo straightened a little. "I do." Masato studied Gojo for a long moment. "I don't understand why he would choose this." "You don't have to," Gojo said quietly, "but I do." Masato looked away. When he glanced back at Gojo, his eyes were full of concern. "He'll be carrying the weight of judgment, of scrutiny." "Not alone," Gojo answered without hesitation. "I'm here." "You seem very sure of yourself." "I have to be," Gojo answered. Masato studied Gojo again. Something shifted. Not acceptance, not yet, just an acknowledgement. He turned back to the sink and picked up a vegetable peeler and a potato. "Breakfast is at 8. Gojo paused a moment longer. "Got it," he said, finally turning away. It wasn't his place to persuade Geto's dad to accept them. Geto's goal was to let them know who he was and who he loved. All Gojo could do from this point on was to be there for Geto if that acceptance never came. He walked up the stairs 2 at a time, hoping Geto's headache didn't worsen while he was waiting. Geto was sitting in the middle of the bed with his head in his hands. "Sorry it took so long." Gojo climbed into bed and sat behind him, straddling Geto between his long legs. Geto leaned against Gojo and took a long drink of water. "It's nice and cold," he remarked, screwing the cap back on. Gojo chuckled. "I know that's how you like it." Geto absent-mindedly ran his hands up and down Gojo's legs. Gojo rested his chin on Geto's shoulder. "Are you feeling better?" "A little bit." Geto's head still throbbed and his eyes were swollen from crying, but he smiled. The sound of Gojo's voice against his ear tickled. "Do you want to try to sleep a little more? Breakfast isn't until 8. Geto's hands paused over Gojo's legs. "How do you know what time breakfast is?" Geto asked. "I bumped into your dad in the kitchen," admitted Gojo. "At this time of the night?" Geto yawned. "Yeah. Come on, let's try to get a little more sleep," Gojo coaxed. They lay back down and buried themselves under the covers. Gojo took a while longer than Geto to fall asleep. His heart ached for Geto after the conversation with his dad. A few hours later, while Gojo took his turn in the shower, Geto put on Gojo's hoodie and went to the room next door when he heard someone shuffling around. Aiko was at a large table folding scraps of fabric into neat piles. Geto stood in the doorway, watching quietly. Besides the strands of gray hair peppering her neatly styled bob, his mom hadn't changed much since he last saw her. When was it? A year ago? Longer than that? "Need any help?" Geto asked. "If you want," Aiko answered, not looking up. Geto stood beside her and reached into a laundry basket filled with fabric remnants from his mom's past tailoring jobs. "Why are you working on Christmas Day?" Geto wondered. "This isn't really work. I just need to keep my hands busy." "Dad must be cooking right now." "I'm trying to stay out of his way," Aiko smiled. Her husband enjoyed cooking, but he liked doing it alone. This worked out well since Aiko's tailoring projects could run late into the evening, no matter what time she started. She was always grateful to have a hot meal waiting for her when she took a break. They worked in silence for a while. Then Aiko set her fabric down and braced her hands on the table. "Suguru," she started. Geto glanced over at Aiko and waited. She couldn't bring herself to ask why he was hospitalized. She didn't understand the world Geto belonged to, but she never really tried. When he was a young child, Geto began to see things that she or Masato couldn't see, sometimes running into the house terrified, claiming monsters were after him. He began to have trouble sleeping and withdrew from hanging out with the few friends he had. He played alone and spent hours at his desk drawing pictures of the things he claimed to see. Aiko remembered the crumpled up drawings that filled his wastebasket. Aiko and Masato had taken him to counselors, spiritual advisors, and psychiatrists, until someone in their school district gave their information to a special academy. Someone from the academy's psychology department came to their home to assess Geto, and they were notified that he had special abilities. He would be required to attend Tokyo Metropolitan Curse Technical College at age 15, sooner if his abilities became disruptive. They had to sign non-disclosure agreements with the school. A representative from the college visited every month to check on Geto. It was a stressful time for all of them, but Aiko found herself pulling away instead of comforting her son. Their relationship had felt broken since then. "Are you doing okay now?" was all Aiko could manage to ask. "I'm okay now, but if I didn't have Satoru, I might not have..." Geto's voice trailed off. Aiko didn't encourage him to continue. A familiar, uncomfortable quiet settled over them. They heard the bathroom door open and footsteps coming down the hall. Aiko looked at her watch. "It's almost time for breakfast," she said abruptly. She put the last of her folding onto the table and started out of the room. Geto followed her. "We'll be right there, Mom." Breakfast was scrambled eggs, sausage, miso soup, steamed rice, natto, and a side salad drizzled with Masato's homemade yuzu dressing. It was more than Gojo and Geto were used to eating in the morning, but it was delicious. Neither Aiko nor Masato said much throughout the meal. Then while Masato was still sipping his coffee and Aiko finished her tea, Gojo and Geto excused themselves. Gojo wanted to see some family photos. Geto grabbed some worn albums from their place on the family room bookshelf. They settled on the couch. Gojo put his arm around Geto's shoulder as they flipped through the thick pages, yellowing with time. First were the pictures of his parents, posed ones of Aiko showing off her baby bump in a loose floral dress. Masato proudly stood next to her, his long black hair tied in a ponytail draped over his shoulder, bangs hanging over one eye. Gojo tapped on the photo. "Look how long your dad's hair was. Now I can really see the resemblance." Geto smiled. He was looking at these photos with new eyes, as if he were seeing them for the first time too. When they got to the pages of Geto as a newborn, Gojo quieted. Geto's chubby cheeks and eyes squinting from the overhead lights tugged at his heart. There was a photo showing his tiny fingers curled around his mother's finger. Gojo wanted to reach out and touch that delicate little hand. But there was something else about the pictures that made his chest clench. The baby in the photos looked so much like one of the twins from his vision. He squeezed Geto's shoulder and blinked back the tears that unexpectedly sprung into his eyes. Geto was too busy looking at the happy expressions on his parents' faces to notice. They leafed through photos of first solid foods, first steps, first birthday, first day of school. They laughed as Gojo pointed out the cute outfits Geto wore, his face smeared with birthday cake, making goofy expressions at the camera. Gojo couldn't get over what a little man Geto already looked like when he was a child. The strong jaw, wide mouth, and narrow eyes were already prominent, and he'd always had a head of long hair, worn down and often tucked behind one ear. As Geto looked at how he aged in the photos, he realized with sadness that his demeanor changed the older he got. Around age 5, the photos of him smiling became few and far between. This was around the time I started seeing curses, he thought, a lump forming in his throat. Gojo saw the change too. The older Geto became, the less family photos there were, until the albums only consisted of his official elementary class photos, back when he still attended public schools. The pages of the last album were half empty. Geto shut the album gently and ran his hand over the cover, as if apologizing for failing his childhood self. The nostalgia he'd felt when they first looked through the albums was gone. Now he just felt grief. Gojo noticed the sadness cloud over Geto's eyes. Gojo clasped him on the back of the neck and planted a soft kiss on his temple. "You want to go for a walk? Show me around the neighborhood?" Geto nodded. "Yeah, let's go." Geto's neighborhood was quiet, and the houses all started to look the same the longer they walked. Geto was quieter than usual. His scarf was wrapped around his neck so many times it covered his mouth. The dry, cold air made the tip of his nose and cheekbones pink. He held onto Gojo's hand as they followed the sidewalks with no destination in mind. Gojo's heart ached for Geto and the childhood that was stolen by curses. Neither of their childhoods resembled the happy ones they'd seen on TV. Geto remembered there was a park nearby and steered Gojo in its direction. The playground was empty. It was too chilly for the little ones to be out. Gojo was the first to climb up one of the slides, making Geto smile as he whizzed down the freezing metal and stumbled to a standing position at the bottom. He urged Geto to take a turn. Geto climbed up the metal ladder and stood on the platform at the top, looking around at the bare trees and the tops of nearby homes. His eyes fell on Gojo. Gojo was watching him, smiling softly, as if he were the only thing that existed. Geto crouched down onto the top of the slide. The cold metal numbed his bottom. He slid down and pitched forward when his feet hit the sand at the bottom. Gojo intercepted him and circled his arms around his waist. "Caught you." Geto placed a palm against his cheek. "You took your glasses off," Geto noticed. "Why?" he asked, concerned. Gojo could go into sensory overload if he went too long without covering his eyes. Those eyes that saw cursed energy in microscopic detail and processed everything in high resolution. His brain was constantly analyzing the world around him. He'd made himself sick from fatigue a few times after keeping his eyes exposed. Gojo shrugged. "No reason, but one day I hope I can control the six eyes in a way where I don't have to wear glasses or blindfolds anymore. I'll put the glasses back on if it bothers you." Geto wrapped his arms around Gojo's neck. "It doesn't bother me. I love your eyes. They're stunning." Gojo blushed at the compliment. He lowered his gaze and planted a light kiss on Geto's forehead. They lingered on the playground a little longer. Geto offered to push Gojo on the swings. He grinned as Gojo went higher and higher. They let themselves laugh like they were kids again. Geto sat on the swing next to him while Gojo caught his breath. Gojo grabbed onto Geto's swing. "I wish I knew you when we were kids. We would have been best friends." "We're not best friends now," Geto teased lightly. "We're bester than best," Gojo teased back. After a moment, "But it still would have been nice to know another kid who was just like me." "Yeah," Geto agreed, remembering how, as a child, he saw too many things that frightened him, things that no one else could see. At some point, he had convinced himself it was his fault the scary things appeared, and he didn't want to expose anyone to his monsters. So he stayed away from people. Geto accepted loneliness as the norm. Gojo held his hand out and Geto took it. They slowly walked back to Geto's home. For lunch, they had simple ham and cheese sandwiches and leftover Odin stew. Christmas dinner would be the special meal of the day, and Masato wanted everyone to save their appetite. Geto wondered if his dad had left the kitchen at all since their arrival. After they ate and washed their dishes, Gojo noticed a stack of colorful flyers and programs on a little stand near the kitchen table. "Whoa, you guys went to all these plays?" he exclaimed. Aiko was wiping down the table and looked over at him. "We didn't go to any of those. Those are the programs and playbills from the productions I've sewed costumes for," she explained. Gojo started leafing through the programs. "My family used to take me to plays all the time." From a young age, Gojo's clan insisted on giving him a well-rounded education. Music, arts, and science were some of the only subjects that didn't bore him to death. On theater nights, he enjoyed being able to leave his compound and attend stage plays in the city. It was the only time he spent one-on-one with his biological parents. He didn't care what production they saw or how uncomfortable his dress-up clothes were. He was happy to be able to sit with them, even if they hardly said a word to each other. Gojo held up a thick playbill. "Don't tell me you made the costumes for this. The Fox Bride," Gojo said excitedly. "This was my favorite. I've seen it like 5 times. Aiko finally smiled. "I'm tailoring some of the new cast costumes for it right now." "What? Can I see?" Gojo grabbed Geto's wrist and followed Aiko up the stairs to her sewing room. He grinned as Aiko showed him a rack of formal kimonos worn by the Fox Bride's wedding procession. Geto took a seat at his mom's sewing table and watched in amusement as Gojo talked about his favorite parts in the play. Gojo and his mom rifled through the hangers of clothes. "Every time I watched it, I hoped that the heir would finally be allowed to follow the bride into the spirit world, but it never happened." Gojo clutched his chest dramatically. Geto couldn't remember his mom smiling so much. She even giggled. "Satoru, I want to show you something since you like the play so much. Just be careful, it's not completed yet and half of it is held together by pins, but..." Aiko unzipped a massive black garment bag and gingerly pulled out a formal wedding kimono the color of gold. It was the Fox Bride's wedding kimono. "This is amazing." Gojo didn't want to risk touching the exquisite fabric, but Aiko held out the long sleeves of the furisode so he could see the textures of the embroidered fabric and show off her tiny, even stitching on the finished parts. Geto felt a slight pang of jealousy. Gojo had made a connection with his mom, something he'd longed to do his entire life. But then again, he'd never given her the attention or appreciated her work like Gojo had. He was too busy trying to hide. He was jealous, but he was glad too. Maybe she could tell his dad how sweet and funny Gojo was. Geto wondered if she had told his dad about him and Gojo. If she did, Geto couldn't tell. Dinner smelled delicious. Masato had literally spent all day in the kitchen, chopping, slicing, mixing, baking, boiling, and stirring, until he was finally able to set all his food out for everyone to enjoy. His big pot of nikujaga was the star of the show, a hearty meat and vegetable stew. The beef was tender, the broth was nicely balanced, and the veggies were seasoned perfectly. It was filling enough to eat on its own, but Masato hadn't stopped there. He made homemade bread, and there was steamed rice, various tsukemono set out in tiny ceramic dishes, grilled mackerel, and a salad paired with a creamy sesame dressing. Gojo helped himself to a little of everything, then reached for seconds. Geto kept it simple, pouring the nikujaga over a heap of rice on his plate. The beef stew was good, but something about how good it was made Geto pause. His dad had barely said one word to him since they arrived, but he spent all day cooking food that would be devoured in less than an hour. He could have made something simple, chicken and rice, or soba noodles, but he made something that took effort and time. He put care into the food. Geto thought about the dinners his father made for him when he was still living at home. Even when he returned from work, tired from being at the office all day, he put on an apron and made a proper meal for Geto and his mom. He hardly spoke to Geto back then either. Food was his communication, Geto realized. Geto knew that if he got hungry later in the night, he could open the fridge and find snacks his dad prepared, separated into small containers that he could bring up to his room. His dad was the one who left breakfast on the table before catching the train to work, and he was the one who packed his bento for school. Maybe his dad didn't have the words, but he'd said whatever he could through the things he made in the kitchen. And the meal he was eating now? The meal was worth 1,000 words. Geto looked over at his dad. Masato looked up from his plate. His eyes rested on his son's face for a long moment. He wordlessly motioned towards the bread plate. Geto smiled to himself and took a slice, buttering it generously. His parents were far from perfect. They could have handled things differently, but nobody prepared them to raise a son with strange abilities, especially when they had none of their own to relate to. His dad reached out to him with food, and what about his mom? He thought about the long hours his mom worked in her sewing room. After her commission jobs were complete, she would use the leftover fabric to make clothes for Geto. He'd always had nice button-up shirts and well-fitted slacks. For temple and special occasions, he had several haori made with extra scraps of the most expensive fabric. His favorite purple haori was one his mom made for him before he left for college. Maybe that was his mom's way of communicating her care for him, keeping him clothed and warm with the things she created. Even if it wasn't quite true, Geto decided believing this was better than thinking she didn't love him at all. Geto looked across the table at Gojo. Gojo had no trouble telling Geto he loved him. He had no trouble demonstrating that he loved him. And yet, Geto still fell into deep bouts of depression, marked with fear of losing Gojo's love and devotion. Gojo looked at Geto. "Don't tell me you're full already," he gently teased. He had his glasses back on and pushed them up the bridge of his nose before picking up his spoon again. "No, I'm not," Geto said. "Good, because your dad made peanut butter and chocolate mochi for dessert." Aiko spoke up from the other end of the table. "I'll get it." Masato stood up and retrieved a small tray off the counter. The pink mochi were filled with peanut butter, and the green ones had chocolate. He set the tray beside Geto's plate. "Thanks, Dad," Geto said, taking one of each. Maybe it was his imagination, but he thought he saw his dad smile when he sat back down. There was no Christmas tree or holiday decorations in the Geto household, but they retreated to the living room to exchange gifts. Gojo brought the packaged fabric and large gift bag with a briefcase down from Geto's room. He motioned for Geto to give the fabric to his mom, but Geto urged Gojo to present it to her. He was the one who thought of the gift, chose the colors, and paid. Gojo set the rectangular bolts of fabric against the coffee table, in front of where Aiko was seated on the couch. He suddenly felt self-conscious. He wanted her to like the gift. He sat back down next to Geto and waited. Aiko thanked Gojo, then looked at the large packages. She looked at her husband. Masato said nothing. Aiko picked one and tore the brown paper carefully down the seam where it was taped. She had opened the blue silk, and her eyes grew wide when the paper fell away. This is beautiful," she exclaimed. She was used to working with high-quality fabrics, but she had never outright had her own supply of it, and this was fine-quality silk. This one bolt could set someone back 230,000 yen. She gently ran her hand over the flat side of the bolt. Her mind already raced with the beautiful things she could make with it, but it was too extravagant. Who was this Gojo Satoru, a man that could make her sullen son smile so easily and could afford to give a gift like this? Aiko lowered her gaze. "This is too nice." Gojo looked up in alarm. It sounded like a rejection. "Thank you." Gojo exhaled a breath he didn't know he was holding. "I'm almost afraid to open the next package," Aiko said. "Don't be, Mom," Geto spoke up, pleased that his mom accepted the gift. Aiko was equally impressed with the bolt of fuchsia silk. She thanked both Gojo and Geto, but knew it was Gojo who had been the one to make such a purchase. "Go ahead," Geto told Gojo, handing him the gift for Masato. Gojo stood up and gave Geto's dad the large gift bag. Masato cleared his throat and set it on the floor. He looked inside before reaching in. He pulled out the drawstring dust bag with the leather brand's logo printed on the front and paused. He pulled the drawstring bag open and slowly pulled out the leather briefcase that Gojo had searched high and low to find. He set it on the coffee table. It was the most extravagant thing ever gifted to him. Nowhere near the cost of his wife's gift, but he knew that wasn't the point. He ran his finger over the stitching. This is well made. Suguru said you've been working for the same company since before he was even born. That's impressive. That's dedication. It's just a briefcase, but it's strong and sturdy, Gojo explained. That's very considerate of you. He leaned back on the couch. Aiko touched his knee, then picked up the 2 rectangular gift boxes that were next to her. Both gifts were wrapped in green and red plaid paper, but Geto's box was larger than Gojo's. Gojo waited for Geto to go first. Geto secretly hoped the gift was handmade, to prove that his theory about his mom's sewing was true. He tore the wrapping paper noisily and crumpled it into a neat ball. He held his breath as he lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on top of white tissue paper, was a bright blue hand-sewn haori. Up close, one could tell it was patterned with black branches and tiny red and yellow accents, representing birds and flowers in the trees. Geto lifted the silky fabric out of the box and held it up. Try it on, encouraged Gojo. Geto stood up and slid his arms through the wide sleeves. He modeled it shyly, turning his body just a little to show his mom that it fit. I don't know if it still is, but Suguru's favorite color used to be blue, Aiko remarked. Geto blushed. Blue, like Gojo's eyes, he thought. It still is, Mom. Thank you. He kept the haori on and sat back down. This is exactly what I wanted, he added quietly. Gojo opened his gift next. Geto's mom had made him something too. A soft fleece scarf the color of deep gold with matching tassels. It's almost the same color as the fox bride's kimono, Gojo smiled. Thank you. Aiko chuckled. If I have remnants left over from their costume, I'll see if I can make you your own haori, she told him. Gojo beamed. I'd like that. When Gojo and Geto excused themselves to retreat upstairs, Geto glanced down from the staircase and saw his dad reach for the briefcase and run his hand against the leather. Geto folded his new haori carefully and packed it away while Gojo changed for bed. It was their last night at Geto's home. Their visit wasn't full of hugs and kisses and fond memories, but Geto was still glad they'd made the trip. Yaga had told Geto to settle his affairs before he went back into the field. The one thing he wanted to do in case he never returned from a mission was to let his parents know about Gojo. He was satisfied that he was able to at least tell his mom. Maybe he'd get a chance to tell his dad, but he didn't have the same urgency to say the words to him. He wasn't sure if he was wrong for feeling that way. Geto paused while he was repacking their duffel bag. He rubbed his temples. He'd felt off last night, but couldn't really do anything about it. He'd been struggling all day, but kept it to himself. Part of him was surprised Gojo didn't notice. Another part of him was relieved. Hey, come here. Gojo was already in bed. Geto didn't look at him right away. I'll help you with that in the morning. Turn off the lights and come here, Gojo gently coaxed. Geto flipped the switch by the door and crawled into bed. Are you going to be all right till we get back to the dorm? Gojo asked softly, smoothing Geto's hair out of his face. So, he did notice. Not that I could really hide it from him, Geto thought, but his needs embarrassed him nonetheless. What do you mean? Geto asked, pretending he didn't know what Gojo was talking about. Suguru, you haven't been feeling well since we got here. Gojo shifted closer to Geto. Geto couldn't keep up the charade. Satoru, I'm so pent up, he admitted, hiding his face in Gojo's shoulder. Gojo clasped Geto gently on the back of the neck. The heat radiating off Geto's skin was unmistakable. I could take care of you if you want, Gojo offered. We don't have to fuck. I can use my hands or my mouth. It just feels wrong to do something like that here, don't you think? Geto wondered, hoping Gojo would argue with him and get his way. If it makes you uncomfortable, we don't have to do anything, Gojo said, squeezing Geto's shoulder reassuringly. What? That's it? No reasoning with me? No trying to convince me? Geto tried to keep his voice down. Oh, so you do want me to get you off, Gojo said with a smile in his voice. I wish I didn't need it so bad. Don't say that, Gojo said. I live to give it to you, he laughed. But what do you want? Hands, mouth, ass? I want everything, Gojo clutched at Gojo's waist, but I don't want anyone to hear. Turn around then. I'm going to use my hand, Gojo decided. Geto flipped over and pressed his back against Gojo. Gojo reached around and slipped his hand down Geto's pajama pants. His long fingers wrapped around Geto's dick. Geto gasped, then covered his face with his pillow. He was starting to pant too loud. Gojo curled his body around him and bit the back of Geto's shoulder while he used his hand. Geto almost teared up in relief as his orgasm approached quickly. Come for me, Suguru. I want to feel you drip from my fingers, Gojo murmured in his ear, knowing that would push him over the edge. Geto's body strained, then jolted, as he climaxed and released. Geto's cum overfilled Gojo's hand and spilled onto his thigh. Geto put the pillow down. You have no idea how good that felt, he confessed. I have some idea, Gojo chuckled. He wiped his hand on his pajama pants. He pulled Geto closer and kissed the back of his neck. Good night. I love you, he whispered, shutting his eyes. Geto felt relaxed for the first time since arriving home. His head no longer hurt from trying to ignore the soaring temperature of his skin and the painful erections when he didn't get any release. He thought about how lucky he was that Gojo understood his sexual needs. He let me get off and expected nothing in return, Geto thought. He was satisfied that I was satisfied and left it at that. Geto was also relieved that Gojo hadn't pointed out something that was starting to become clearer every time he had these fevers, as if Gojo knew something about him that he wanted Geto to discover for himself. Geto still wasn't ready to face the obvious, even if he wanted it to be true. That his body wasn't just a vessel for an army of cursed spirits. His body might be able to carry a child.